And then the last value of Ruby is to be open, to be available to people. We talked about Ruby being transparent at the language level, but the process also has to be transparent. The way that Max develops Ruby, the way that we distribute Ruby as open source software, the way people can contribute back to Ruby, the way you can now write Ruby gems to extend Ruby, all of these things make Ruby a very open language, and that's really important. But we're changing. We no longer have just one player here. Ruby is no longer just the one child. Like we said, Ruby is dating. Ruby is now seeing other people. And now we have to think about those other people. JRuby, IronRuby, Rubinius, all these other people. How do these values apply in this new world as Ruby is growing up? Well, we still have to be nice to developers. We have to be compatible. So I want my Ruby programs that run on Matt-Sans Ruby also to run on JRuby, IronRuby, whatever else. Because there has to be just one Ruby. They have to be documented so that we know what's going on. And everybody has to find, ideally, some consistent way of documenting them. They have to integrate with their environment. What does that mean? If you're running Ruby in a particular machine, it needs to be able to access that machine well and fluidly. The demonstrations we had of JRuby yesterday were a really good example of that. The fact that we still have Ruby, it's just Ruby, but we can integrate into the Java environment. We can access Swing, EJBs inside Ruby is a perfect example of that integration. Ideally, we want to integrate with tools. Remember, we're being nice to developers. So, if we're a developer on a Microsoft platform, we probably want good Visual Studio support. People ask questions about NetBeans support for JRuby. And of course, real programmers, good Emacs support is important. But we need to get access to tools and make it work. And finally, it has to work. So we have to be sure not to put out new versions of Ruby until we're 100% convinced that they work. And this is a big, big problem. Because right now, the definition of work for a Ruby interpreter is, does it run Rails? And yes, Rails does do a lot of very complicated things. I suspect it took quite a lot of effort to get Rails to run on JRuby. But it's not the only program out there. And so we have to think about what does it mean to be a working Ruby interpreter. We have to be clear and readable, Matt says. I agree 100%. And one of the important things to me is that we do not extend Ruby with specific details. So if I'm the Microsoft version of Ruby, I do not want Microsoft-specific extensions built into the language. Similarly, for JRuby, I don't want Sun-specific or Java-specific extensions built into the Ruby language. I know you haven't done that, I'm just saying in general. Because we want to avoid the J++ situation. We have to be flexible and agile, Matt says. And one way of interpreting that is Ruby is not a corporate language. And one of the joys of Ruby is the fact that we still have this idea that, yeah, everyone can contribute and it's a lightweight process. And if you ask Matt, you know, what process do we go through to say, does this go into the language or not? Right? There's no committees involved. There are no international meetings involved. There are no memos involved. All it is does Max like it? And that's what we want to keep. Now, there's a problem with that. Because that conflicts with the previous idea that everything has to work. How do you know that your Ruby works if there is no specification? If there is no language specification, if there is no library specification, then how do you know that Ruby works, that your version of Ruby works? I don't know what the answer is to this, but the idea that we have to go out and write specifications worries me a little bit. Because once we start doing that, I think it can be very easy for it to become a very political activity. And we don't want politics in Ruby. So we have to think very hard about how we do that. The process has to be open. And here I have to, if I had a hat, I would take off my hat to the JRuby team. They've done an incredible job of making this an open process. They have given us the source code. They've let us play with it. They have people who are not Sun employees contributing. It's just a great way of developing software. The code has to be open, obviously. The process has to be open. No secret decisions. Everybody has to get involved. Everybody has to have a say. And the people have to be open. Because it's all about community. The process has to be two-way. We have to have contributions going both from people implementing Ruby and from the community back. Ideally, I would like to see sharing of code between all of these different implementations of Ruby. Rubinius is an interesting starting point for this, in that it has implementations of Ruby libraries written in Ruby. It'd be really nice if we could find a way of getting that to be the standard for Ruby libraries. I don't think we will until we get to faster VMs or faster support for faster Ruby code. But that would be my ideal. Because that way, we don't have to maintain 4 or 5 or 6 different libraries. We don't have to worry about differences between all those libraries. They all just work because there's only one of them. And I think if we can find a way of doing that, that would be great. So, our child is talking to other people. It's going out with other people. It's spending some time over at Sun. It's spending some time over at Microsoft. And we try and give it the right values to help it along. But we can also give a little bit of advice as it goes. Assuming it asks us. What advice will we give? Well, really, there's not much we can give, apart from saying that change will happen. We cannot stop it now. Ruby has gone from being a really fun, small little community into being an international language. Ruby is now serious. And we can't turn that back. Now, there are dangers involved with this. And we have to give advice to say, please be careful of these different dangers. There's a risk of a damage to the community. We've already seen little bits of infighting taking place between various people and various teams. And it's kind of like,